Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this session of the webinar on the future of the island of Ireland. These webinars have been running now for quite a long time, and they become a sort of institution in their own way. We are very grateful to the Centre for Geopolitics of Polis at the University of Cambridge for sponsoring this seminar very generously, and to Sidney Sussex College. Without further ado, let me introduce the moderator of the session, Barry Colfer. Has great technical abilities as they enabled us to sail through many sessions so far. And I'm sure this one will also be a great success from all possible counts. And Barry will introduce the three panelists. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you so much, Eugenio. As always, good evening, everybody. Good evening, those in Europe, and good afternoon, at least one colleague joining from North America. And we're really thrilled tonight to be continuing our series with Matt Carthy TD for Cavan Monaghan, former MEP. I'll introduce Matt properly in a moment. We're also very fortunate to have two great discussants tonight with Professor Niamh Gallagher and Dr. Peter Sloman. As always, the format will be Matt's going to intervene for between 0 and 10 minutes. This will be followed by a discussion involving two discussants tonight, the aforementioned Niamh and Peter. And this will allow time for questions and answers. Please use the time when Matt and the others are speaking to think up questions and put them in the questions and answers box. And as always, we'll get through as many as we can. So to introduce our speaker tonight, Matt Carthy is Sinn Féin TD for Cavan Monaghan and party spokesperson for agriculture, food and the marine. Matt has been a Sinn Féin elected rep since 1999 when he was elected to Carrickmacross Town Council at the tender age of 21. Matt also served as a member of Monaghan County Council from 2004 to 2014, being successfully elected on 3 occasions, and he was elected as Mayor of County Monaghan for the 2008-2009 term. In 2014, Matt was elected to the European Parliament, serving on the Economic and Monetary Affairs and Agriculture and Rural Development Committees, when he was a strong advocate for rural communities, and was re-elected as MEP in 2019. In February 2020, at the last shock general election, Matt was elected to the Dáil for Cavan Monaghan, securing a whopping 16,310 votes, the highest ever received by a candidate in that constituency. Matt is a member of the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine and Public Accounts Committee. Matt was a founding member of Ógra Sinn Féin, the party's youth wing, and served as the party's national organiser. The first discussant Matt will have tonight is going to be Dr. Peter Sloman. Peter is senior lecturer in British politics and he's a fellow of Churchill College. After Peter, we're going to hear from Professor Niamh Gallagher, who's a University Associate Professor in Modern British and Irish History and a Fellow of St. Cat's. Without further ado, Matt, thanks again for being with us, and you have up to 10 minutes.
Barry, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this series and to participate in a debate called The Future of the Island of Ireland. It's a big title, I have to say, that could go in 100 different directions. But to start, I'm very positive about the future. I also know, I have to say, and I'm minded of the fact that just as in the past, we will face huge challenges. And if the past 2 years have taught us anything, it's that some of those challenges are probably even beyond our comprehension right now. But we do know what some of the tests that we will face will be. It'll be the challenge of providing homes to future generations, of delivering health services that work, that provide the care that people need, regardless of their personal wealth or where they live, of securing an economy that's stable, that's underpinned by fairness and a regional balance that allows people to find work and a quality of life in the place that they themselves grew up, if that's what they want. Our climate action obligations will bring opportunities, but also great challenges that will require forward thinking, big planning and a strategy that must include rather than dictate to ordinary workers, families and communities. The future of agriculture will be a key conversation as we attempt to continue to produce food in a way that's sustainable environmentally, but while also protecting our family farm network that is the heartbeat of Irish rural communities. There will be countless other tests, social, political, economic and significant constitutional debates that we will need to navigate. And it's in acknowledgement of these tests that I approach the big debate of our time, that of Irish unity. And there will always be some that will argue that the project of Irish reunification must be put on hold until other issues are resolved or other challenges overcome. Just as Republican leaders in the past were accused of asserting that Labour must wait, we've now recently seen a leader of an Irish Labour Party essentially saying that unity must wait. And both were wrong propositions. Now is the time, in my view, to talk about Irish unity. And in my view, the question is often put in the wrong order. Rather than asking whether there are other challenges that should be addressed before contemplating Irish unity, we should instead be asking, are we better placed addressing those challenges in a united country? Because all of the big problems will still be there in a united Ireland. But it's my contention that we will be better placed to overcome them, working together under a united political framework. In essence, I believe that Ireland can be better, stronger and fairer if we're united. And Brexit actually provides a good example. The decision by Britain to leave the European Union would have always presented difficulties to Ireland. Britain is by far our largest trading partner. It stands between us and the rest of Europe. We have what is generously described as a shared history, and that's generous to the British for the avoidance of any doubt. But nobody would suggest that all of those difficulties were actually made more difficult by the fact that we're a divided island, that as well as Britain leaving the EU, it intended to take part of Ireland with it, regardless of the fact that a majority there voted to remain. And no one who advocated for Brexit essentially gave any thought to its impact on the north of Ireland or the peace process. Very few people could argue that the partition of Ireland was a success. Most, I believe, would recognise that it was an unmitigated disaster for the whole country. And much obviously has been written about the outworkings of partition on the northern state, single party government, systemic discrimination, oppression and conflict. But another outworking was an ultra-conservative state in the south, and partition cast a dark shadow from which we are only slowly beginning to emerge. So undoing of partition will bring huge benefits to our country. Economically, to me, it's a no-brainer. Every objective economic analysis of reunification has pointed to substantial growth following the removal of the border and its associated barriers. That isn't even to mention the efficiencies of addressing the duplication of services and infrastructure. It's hard to argue that an island on the edge of Europe with less than 7 million people is best served by 2 healthcare systems, 2 education systems, 2 transport strategies, 2 economic development agencies that aren't only operating back to back, but are actually competing against each other. A united Ireland will have a bigger and stronger economy that will benefit people in every section and every community across the island. It's a huge opportunity that we should grasp. So if, like me, one comes at this debate with the view that the partition of Ireland has been bad and that the unification of our country will be good for everyone who lives here, then political representatives not only have a right, but in my view, an obligation to pursue that objective. And that's not to say that any of this will be easy. Nothing politically worthwhile ever is, but we have the tools and advantages that previous generations didn't have. And primarily, we have the Good Friday Agreement. It's not perfect, it isn't always clear, but it does provide the peaceful democratic process in which we can have the debate, secure the referendum and deliver its outcome. We also have the restated commitment from the European Union that in the event of Irish reunification, the whole country will be part of the EU. Ask a Scottish independence campaigner which limb they'd give for that assurance pre-referendum. So as I see it, as a united Irelander, the only thing standing between the status quo and the united Ireland is our ability to convince others of its merits. And some will clearly never be convinced, and that's perfectly okay and understandable. Our job isn't to convince those people necessary to vote yes in a referendum. It's to show that they've nothing to fear in the result itself. But there is a growing proportion of people, particularly in the north, who are willing to engage in debate. Obviously, they have practical concerns. They want to retain a single tier public healthcare system, something I think we must all be committed to delivering. They'll want to see the economics spelled out. They'll want to know the details of any transition period. They'll want to know what the constitutional framework of a united Ireland will be, what protections will be in place for those of a British identity. Basically, they will want to know what unity will mean for them, their families, and their communities. And all of those are questions that we need to start answering. Each of us that aspire to unity has our own vision and our own answers to those questions. But I think it's imperative that we come together in a structured manner to provide the answers and to facilitate the debate, to plan an approach that will not only deliver Irish unity, but ensures that we maximise its potential to create a better and a fairer Ireland for everyone. So that work, in my view, must start now, and the Irish government has to play a central role. And it can do so by creating the space and the mechanism for debate and planning, by creating an All-Ireland Citizens' Assembly, by establishing an all-party Oireachtas committee, by ensuring on a department-by-department basis that every facet of public policy has an eye to the All-Ireland dimension. And regrettably, thus far, the Irish government sees its role in many respects as reining in the debate rather than facilitating it. But nevertheless, I'm optimistic about all of this. How many generations of politicians can genuinely say that they can be part of delivering a new country? And to me, that's where we are right now. And I think history will judge harshly those that try to avoid the opportunity, who constantly look for reasons not to pursue a project that they know will best serve their people. I think ordinary people are way ahead of politicians on this. Irish unity is a conversation that's happening every day around dinner tables, in pubs, in bars, in community centres, and of course in seminars like this. And I think, like all movements towards progressive political change, governments will eventually catch up. Thank you, Barry.
Oh my good, Matt, that's brilliant. Moving swiftly on, Peter, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry, and thank you, Matt. It's great to have this opportunity to talk with you. At this moment when Sinn Féin is leading in the opinion polls, not only in Northern Ireland, but also in the Republic of Ireland. And it is quite extraordinary to me, as someone who grew up in England in the 1990s, to imagine the prospect of not only a Sinn Féin First Minister, but also a Sinn Féin Taoiseach, and that the party might be in power in all parts of the island in the not too distant future. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because clearly Sinn Féin is in quite a different place in those two jurisdictions. That it is, you know, in the Republic of Ireland, it's very much an insurgent party, a party which is sounding some quite radical notes, particularly on social policy and on the change that Sinn Féin wants to see in the Irish state. In Northern Ireland, it's been a party of government now for what, more or less 14, 15 years. And I guess I wanted to ask first, what can the two parts of Sinn Féin learn from each other?
Another big question there, Peter. And yes, it is quite phenomenal when the growth of Sinn Féin over the past number of decades. I joined Sinn Féin in 1996 at a time when we didn't have a single MP, a single TD. I think we had about 30 councillors across the country, most of whom were in the north, and a very weak organisational framework. I'm in the building here, Sinn Féin head office, where I would have attended my first meetings back in those days, and leaving this building would have invariably meant a conversation with some friendly special branch men. And to think now that I'm after an hour or so ago leaving Leinster House, where I'm part of a team of 37 Sinn Féin TDs, is quite remarkable. And I think what's more remarkable and more important perhaps is that has built up steadily over a long period of time. So we went from a single TD in 1997 to 5 to 4 to 13 to 23 to 37. So I think that's really important in terms of that the growth isn't built on quicksand, if you like. It's built on hard work in communities, in putting forward political analysis that in time was proved right, but also answering the immediate calls of this generation in relation to things like housing and things like healthcare services and other public services. I think the biggest lesson that we can learn, and this is something that we engage all the time, we operate on an all-Ireland basis. I meet my counterpart in terms of agriculture and rural development from Stormont on a weekly basis. That happens across all portfolios. Every policy that we develop is all Ireland proofed, if you like, so that we're not advocating something in one institution and that runs contrary to what we're saying in another. I think the big lesson that we learn is how difficult government is, and I think it's important that opposition parties recognise that. There's a permanent civil service in every jurisdiction that can be a facilitator of delivering change and can also be a blockage if it's not managed properly. We know that in order to realise projects in terms within budget and on time creates huge challenges, and we faced all of those in the north. Now the north is a unique political experiment, if you like. There's 5 political parties, some of which have diametrically opposing ideologies. Clearly there's a distinction in terms of each party's view of the actual state in which they're operating, but the fundamentals are still the same. We see it as our work and our role in government to deliver change for the better for the people we represent. And I do think that there are lessons that we can learn from the experiences in the executive, including mistakes that were made in the executive, that will absolutely shape our work when the time comes. And I'm hoping it won't be too long before we can lead a government in this jurisdiction as well.
And you have experience in the European Parliament as well, of course. How has parliamentary life changed for you in moving from Brussels back to Dublin and seeing a different side to things?
Yeah, the biggest thing I suppose that I learned, and I probably knew this before I went to the European Parliament, and sometimes you can forget that because that's what institutions do, is actually how irrelevant the European Parliament is to people's lives and to the day-to-day political discourse. Because when I was a member of the European Parliament, I was incredibly busy and I was working on policies and legislative proposals that were really, really important. And it's only when you actually return back to the Dáil and back to your local community on a full-time basis, you actually realise just how far removed people are from that decision-making process, which I think is a failing on the part of the European institutions, which is a bigger debate. But the positive, the thing I liked about the European politics was that you could be working on a piece of legislation consistently for a number of years, and you could take it from a commission proposal or an own initiative proposal within a committee of the European Parliament and watch it go through the whole machinations of the EU political process through trialogues and all of that, and see it come out the other end and almost become an expert on the given topic. Domestically, the big difference with politics is you could be dealing with 100 different things on any given day, and you don't have the same time and wherewithal to actually delve into the depths of the impacts of policies and what it might mean. And I think, again, that's probably a deficiency in terms of how domestic politics works, because it's very much about the current news cycle, and it is very difficult to find the time and the space to actually, really dig apart, what any particular proposal might mean. So a lot of what we do, particularly in opposition, is reacting to government proposals as opposed to shaping new things. And oftentimes we have to take a step back to allow ourselves the space to do that.
I mean, Sinn Féin now, in some ways, is in quite a powerful position as the, by far the largest of the opposition parties, and as the three governing parties try to navigate the challenges of coming out of the pandemic, there'll be all kinds of political opportunities for you. But I guess growth also comes with its own challenges as a party. That you represent a largely rural constituency, but that many of Sinn Féin's gains in recent years have come from a very different kind of voter. Younger people, seats in the Dublin area where attitudes may be quite different. What challenges have you faced in sort of straddling those divides so far?
To say, I haven't found them very pronounced. I would argue that the big divisions in Irish society are class-based more than geographical-based, and there is absolutely a section of the electorate that are served by the status quo. I think that's shrinking, and I think that there's another section of the electorate that want to see progressive change, and they want to see accountability in public life. They want to see us creating, a sense of fairness across how decisions are made. And I think that's been the hallmark of Irish politics for quite a while. And I think it's the hallmark as to why this current government are unpopular, in that there's a sense among a growing proportion of voters that decisions are made at the behest of vested interests, and those who have the inside track, and those who happen to be part of the right circles, as opposed to what's in the best interest of ordinary workers and families. So I find that the distinction. The one, I suppose, area where there are often attempts to wedge division is in the issue of climate action, and particularly the role of farming within that, but also the very fact that I represent a constituency that has less public transport availability than it did when the Green Party came into government, and yet they see the charges that are being put on, filling their car with fuel, or their home heating, or whatever the case may be, increasing all the time. So there is, I suppose, a distinction in terms of the experience and the outworking of public policy with regard to that particular issue. But again, I don't think that it's necessarily just based on the people in the city have one view of life and people in more rural communities have a different sense of life. I think it's more to do with the living conditions of people, and that can cross the rural-urban divide, if you like.
But dealing with the climate crisis, and dealing with class divisions in Irish society, and dealing with the challenges involved in convergence between the Republic of Ireland and what is now Northern Ireland, at the same time, could be an extremely difficult task for any government. How would Sinn Féin build consensus around those, potentially quite disruptive changes to people's lives?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, I actually think that dealing with the challenges of climate change and also the deficiencies in terms of regional development, I think we will be better placed dealing with those in the context of an all-Ireland political framework. And to give you an example, so one of the key areas that we're going to have to deal with in terms of climate action is actually putting in place public transport that addresses, just how disparate our population is. And this is the same north and south. We have a rural community that's very ill served by public transport. There are 5 counties across the island of Ireland that have not a single mile of rail network. Those counties are Donegal, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Cavan and Monaghan. Those people who understand the geography of Ireland will notice a very clear relationship with those. The border has been bad in terms of infrastructure. It has actually prevented us from addressing many of those issues. So I don't think that just because something's a challenge should mean that we should shirk away from it. I mean that as sincerely when I'm talking about climate action as I do about Irish reunification, and in terms of actually creating a more fair economic framework. But as I say, I don't believe that Irish unity resolves all these issues overnight. Absolutely doesn't. Those challenges are still going to be there. But I actually believe that we would be better placed in dealing with those in the context that we could actually take the border out of the equation.
Okay, thanks. I have one more question, if I may, which is it possible that Sinn Féin is now perhaps the biggest barrier to Irish unity, insofar as, in some ways, it is Sinn Féin's political strength that is almost the only thing keeping the Unionist electorate together, and that the prospect of a Sinn Féin-led government in Dublin might be an impediment to winning a border poll in which swing voters are not classic Sinn Féin voters? How might the party deal with that?
I don't accept that Sinn Féin is the barrier to reunification. In many respects, Sinn Féin is the vehicle that many people, myself included, saw as the route to actually advocate for Irish unity, because most other political parties have shied away from the debate. I will say this in terms of the debate on Irish unity, and I was heading up our own party's United Ireland project team for a couple of years, and I consistently said this at every engagement. I believe that Irish unity won't happen without Sinn Féin driving putting forward the arguments in favour, facilitating the debate, and encouraging people to come on board. In other words, keeping the issue alive. But I equally believe that it won't happen by us on our own. We need others to, and this is true politically as much as socially and other forums, we need others to get on board. Probably the most oft used sentence in Irish politics is, I would love to see a united Ireland, but just not now. There is no other political ambition where politicians would get away with saying, I think this would be a good idea, I think this would better serve the people I represent, but I'm actually not going to do a single thing about it. So what I actually hope, and I expect, by the way, that in a couple of years' time, you will have Sinn Féin members frustrated by the fact that the SDLP and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the Labour Party and who knows what other parties will have emerged in the meantime, that they will be the advocates for Irish unity, and that they will be selling the project as the positive progressive development that I believe it is now. And all I can say, happy days. I hope it happens sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
That's brilliant, Peter and Matt. Thank you for your honesty and candour. We're going to shift gear and lens now to Professor Niamh Gallagher, who's going to put up a couple of questions to Matt. Niamh.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you, Peter. I really enjoyed that discussion. Matt, I'm going to change tack slightly and bring you back to your role as spokesman for agriculture, marine life and rural affairs. And I want to prod this kind of tension between climate justice on the one hand and looking after your rural constituency and employment and profit on the other. So how do you think land change land use in Ireland should actually change to kind of deliver both of these different interest groups, to look after farmers and rural communities on the one hand, but also in the other to try and reach net zero? Yeah,
so I think it's really important that we recognise that there have been deficiencies in farm policy, both domestically and at an EU level, for the past number of years. Arguably, CAP, when it was established, prioritised the quantity of food that was being produced rather than the quality, to use that term. There's a number of issues that sometimes get lost. So Irish farming is sometimes put as a monocultural single tier profession, when there are very different types of farming, and there are very different types of outworkings in terms of how people manage their own land. So the Irish suckler herd, which is what we're famous for, is actually a very sustainable product, and we can actually, in my view, produce a lot of suckler beef in an environmentally sustainable way, and in a way that benefits communities and allows farmers to remain on the land. Tragically, it's also the least profitable sector of Irish farming. Actually, most suckler farmers are actually operating at a loss if you take away their single farm payments from Europe. And that in turn has led to the huge increase that we've seen over the past decade since the abolition of dairy quotas into the dairy sector. So we've seen a huge expansion of that sector, and that sector now is seen as the only place in which money can be made in agriculture. And of course, that now in turn has led to lots of other concerns in relation to our methane emissions, and also in relation to water quality, and lots of other things. So I think the crux of this is moving beyond the quantity back to the actual quality. We can produce a really good food in an environmentally sustainable way that recognises that Ireland has a unique place in the world, and that we can feed others, and we can produce high quality produce in a way in which deals with that. So how do you deal with all of those things? I narrow it down to what I call the 3 Fs of Irish agriculture, which was 1, a fair cap, that cap payments are actually delivered on the basis of fairness, so that we, in the first instance, get rid of the obscenities of some farm corporate entities drawing down hundreds of thousands of euro of that money that's actually due to go to family farmers, we ensure that we're paying people for doing good things, or doing services on behalf of society, including sequestering carbon, that should be a key element of the basis on which people receive supports. Crucially, then, we need to ensure that we secure fair prices, that farmers actually get so those farmers who are producing best quality food, most sustainably in many ways on a carbon neutral basis, that they actually receive the best product for their food. We have pathetic organic farm levels in Ireland, the second lowest in the EU, second only to Malta. Less than 2% of our land is actually ascribed to organics, and when you consider our international reputation, that's a travesty. But even within that, there are organic beef farmers who are selling their product through conventional factories because there's no market for them to sell their organic beef. Again, that's an absolute travesty, and that's a failure. That's not a failure on the farmers' part. That's a failure on the part of successive governments, because we invest millions not only in the farms themselves but also in bodies like Teagasc in order to carry out research, and on Bord Bia, whose job it is to promote Irish food. And neither of those bodies and neither have successive governments actually said, let's actually start focusing on our really good product that can deliver a fair price. And then finally, I say we need fair play. And what I mean by that is, if we're asking Irish farmers to reduce their level of production, we don't, on the other hand, agree to international trade deals that sees their product just being displaced by Brazilian beef or New Zealand milk that's not being produced even at those sustainable levels. So I think there is a framework in which we can address those issues in a way that serves both farmers, the wider communities that they come from, but also Ireland's own international obligations.
Great, thank you, Matt. And as a historian, it's very nice to see the 3 Fs being reinvigorated.
That's right. That didn't happen by accident, Niamh.
I'm sure it didn't. No, I'm sure it was well planned. Very useful term for those of you interested in the land wars of the late 19th century. Great, thank you. And then briefly, I suppose this also allows us to talk about marine life and fishermen within Ireland. So again, a very similar question here. How can Ireland balance both the needs of fishermen and particularly the practice of trawling, which is very much used within Ireland, with sustainable fishery management, particularly given that the EU might have particular policies which are very destructive actually right now to marine life, the ecosystem and biodiversity?
Yeah, so just to say, I'm the spokesperson agriculture, food and marine, but I actually have a colleague, Padraig McLaughlin, who deals with fisheries issues on a daily basis. And it's actually one of the failings of the Irish government. It's something that we challenge them on all the time, because agriculture and fisheries in their own right are so big that they need people concentrated on those issues. And this is at one point, Ireland would have had a standalone ministry for fisheries. Now we don't even have a junior minister that deals with fisheries specifically. And I think that's a failing, and that allows a scenario to develop whereby our fishing communities feel absolutely isolated. They feel that they've been neglected. They would be the one sector that would argue that EU membership has been bad for them, because they feel that since the very first common fisheries policy that they were, to use their term, sold out. And we have a situation that the majority of fish that you're talking about that's being fished from Irish waters isn't actually being fished by Irish fleets at all. It's fished by fleets from all over Europe. But there is a fundamental problem in terms of the common fisheries policy that I think you're hinting at there, that it's not based on a fair system, and we are depleting our oceans of fish stocks, as well as, on the other hand, polluting them. And it will involve, in my view, an entire re-evaluation of the common fisheries policy that will have to include a re-examination of the quota that's provided to Irish fishermen, and also will have to include an absolute ban on the use of so-called super trawlers, which effectively just soak up, hoover up entire sea stocks and just throw away the discards at huge cost to the planet and to our ocean life. The difficulty is that there is zero appetite at a European level for a re-evaluation of the common fisheries policy. And in my view, therefore, it will take a government to take a lead on that. And I think the Irish government should take a lead, because we've most to gain from a re-evaluation of the CFP. but it won't. If we try and do it in the abstract, it won't happen. I think we need to have a view in terms of what the new policy should look like and what it needs to do in order to address those issues. And then it needs to be brought into the equation the next time that somebody talks about European treaty change, that says Irish support for that treaty change will be dependent on a re-examination of the common fisheries policy, because it's the only way we're going to create the political framework for that conversation to take place.
Great, yeah. And do you have some views on what that policy might look like?
Well, I think it has to look at in terms of re-examination of the division of quotas for the first in the first instance, but then it also needs to have a look at how we actually promote the fishing, the fishing of stock closer to the home base of the particular fleet, how we actually reduce the size of the boats in terms of these super trawlers in particular, and how we can actually ensure that our fish stocks are actually replenished, so that it has to be based on sustainability. Just as we speak about land use, the same has to be the case for our seas.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Okay, Matt, I stalked you on Wikipedia before this began. I hope you don't mind me saying very openly, but I may as well say it. And I found out that you were, as you were chatting about earlier on, born in Birmingham, and that you had family who lived in Britain for a few years whenever you were young. Briefly, with my historian's hat on, for any of those attending who might not know this would be far from unusual. Remember that the Irish were the largest immigrant group in Britain right through until the 1970s, and there's always historically been considerable migration within these islands and between these islands. So nothing very unusual about your experience, Matt, I'm afraid to say. But still, my general question is, what role, if any, do the Irish in Britain play in Sinn Féin's policy for a future vision of Ireland?
Well, first of all, I have a very strong affinity, I have to say, with the Irish in Britain, because of my own experiences. And you're correct, it's not unusual. Although as a child, the greatest insult I could be given in the schoolyard was to be called an Englishman, and I've overcome that particular trait. But I'm very conscious that it was a pure confluence of circumstances that led to my mother from Monaghan and my father from Roscommon meeting up in an Irish centre in Birmingham that resulted in my coming to being, but also a peculiar set of circumstances that resulted in us moving home. So I could be speaking to you tonight in a Brummie accent, and I have to say, and know people who came through the exact same experiences and who remained in Britain, I would be no less Irish for that having happened. I might have a different worldview, but that is another question. And I think one of the really positive things I've seen over my political lifetime is the emergence of, even at a political level, this sense of the Irish in Britain. And I think it can play a really positive role in terms of shaping the British public opinion, particularly in relation to what's happening in Ireland, particularly in the north, and particularly the British government's role in all of that. I find it, peculiar sometimes, because me in Ireland, when you turn on the television news, quite often you will have reflections as to what's happening in Westminster, and certainly issues pertaining to the north are mainstream and are part of our daily discourse. When you go to Britain and just see almost zero concentration on what might be happening and that British government actions have led to, I think that's disappointing, and something that could be corrected by the further engagement of the Irish in Britain. I don't ever expect the Irish in Britain to have, or to be ever considered the same as Irish America, for all sorts of different reasons. But I do think that they can play a positive role, and I do think they have played a positive role. And I have to say, I have huge esteem for those Irish who were politically active in Britain during periods when it was very difficult to do so. I had a very short experience of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, having arrived in, I think it was Birmingham Airport, ironically, in the early 2000s, and just meeting the wrong person when I got off it. But I know that many people went through really difficult times just advocating for Irish unity or in support of the peace process. But I think we've seen a new confidence among the Irish in Britain that I think is really helpful, and I hope, as I say, will play a constructive and positive role in future political developments.
Great. Can I pose a slight contradiction to you, I wonder? So there is, clearly you're speaking very favourably of the Irish in Britain, and there's a lot of strength there in that kind of support, as you're saying. But would it not be fair to say, because Sinn Féin doesn't take its seats up at Westminster, that it's therefore denying a kind of wider political platform for the Irish in Britain to get to know what exactly is at the heart of Sinn Féin's future vision for Ireland?
No, I don't think that's necessarily a contradiction. Like, for example, we don't take any seats in the US House of Representatives either, but nobody would doubt that we have an impact and our supporters make an impact in those forums. We have MPs, they don't take their seats in Westminster, they don't swear an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. I think most Irish in Britain, whether they agree or not, would understand the reasons and why that's the case. But our MPs are actually a really important part of the outreach work that we do across communities in Britain, not only to the Irish community, and clearly that's really important work, but also they play a really big role in terms of our international outreach, because, as you know, London, for example, would have more embassies and the like there. So I don't see a contradiction, and I don't expect that the Irish people who are living in Birmingham or London or Lucan or wherever would expect the elected representative for West Tyrone to breach their own political commitments in order to ensure that they're best served there. So
yeah, that's fair. Thank you very much. Another question, just based on some of what you said. I think it would be very fair to say that there's a real lack of knowledge in Britain when it comes to anything to do with the history of Ireland, indeed the history of Sinn Féin as well, and particularly with the party. I think, again, it might be fair to say that when most people think about Sinn Féin, they think about Sinn Féin as associated with the Troubles. Very little about the evolution of the party since the 70s, since the 80s in particular. So I'm just keen to hear your views on this and see what, if anything, the party is doing to kind of address that lacuna. Is that a lacuna that needs to be addressed? And how do you make Sinn Féin more prominent in the politics of Britain, if indeed you think that's a worthwhile thing to do?
Yeah, as I say, we have a lot of work to do in terms of our work here on the island of Ireland, and it may sound selfish, but we see in the first instance our role in Britain and elsewhere as in promoting and seeking support for our objectives. And we have been doing a lot of work in terms of outreach, and as I say, not only to the Irish community but beyond. And we would have a very healthy and long-standing relationship with many sectors in Britain, particularly the trade union movement and other sectors. And we engage in fora like this whenever the opportunities arise, and we do engage with the British media when those opportunities arise also. I don't know whether it's our job to inform the British public about Irish history or the British government's involvement in Ireland for whatever number of centuries we decide to go back. But absolutely, we're up for debate. We're up for recognising that people come, particularly when we're dealing with the peace process, to every single question with our own historical baggage and with our own historical perceptions. And I think it is really important that all of us may never agree, but that we understand the basis on which other arguments have been formed, because I think anything else actually prevents compromise and prevents solutions being found. And I think lots of people in Britain now are looking at the whole debacle around the Article 16 protocol withdrawal agreement going on, and are probably thinking these pesky Irish are getting in the way of our getting Brexit done. I would contend that it would be in their best interests to examine the matters in a little bit more detail themselves.
Okay, great. I think my internet just says it's unstable, which is slightly unfortunate. I have one more question for you, and if I freeze, I'm just going to hand over to Barry. Barry can just take the road. So I want to ask you about the centenary, if that's okay, Matt, and which centenary. There are several of them, but this is partition, okay, the year in which we're in. And as you said in your intervention, or useful word, I think it's probably fair to say that Sinn Féin has a very clear view on that it sees partition as a travesty, and therefore doesn't want to mark it in any respect. I've seen alternative phrases been used by some of your colleagues, such as they don't want to see it as a celebration, or indeed it shouldn't be commemorated. But being a border person, like myself, I wonder to what extent then is boycotting the centenary, broadly speaking, do feel free to change my wording if you don't think it's accurate, but broadly speaking, boycotting the centenary, is that in a way obscuring the experiences of what happened to the very people who had to live through it 100 years ago? And what would you suggest, what would you do in order to try to recover those experiences in a way that you think is politically acceptable?
Yeah, see, to be quite frank and honest, I see partition as an absolute travesty that was imposed on our country. I come from, me and you are slightly different. I come from a place I often describe it as, were it not for a slip of the pen when somebody was drawing an artificial line on a map, I could have been told that I was a British citizen. You were on the other side of that line. And I have to say, I spoke about being born in England. I actually lived in the south and in the west, and it was actually 13 or 14, maybe a bit younger, when we moved back to Carrickmacross. And the formative experience of my life was because I have a huge interest in history, and particularly around the Tan War and the Civil War and around that period of the 20s. But I'll never forget the occasion in which I was in a car that was traveling to the nearest village, which is a small place called Cullaville, about 6 miles away from my home, and encountered, as far as I was concerned, modern day Black and Tans, the British Army, patrolling South Armagh, and it was a very aggressive, hostile experience. And to me, as a young person, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to live under that all the time, particularly as far as they were concerned, and as far as I was concerned, those communities and the people who lived there were every bit as Irish as I was. Yet they were enduring that on a daily basis. And to me, that's what partition meant. And to those people, that was the real life experiences of partition. So yeah, to try and answer your question, of course we need to mark the partition of our country and the creation of the Northern state, but it needs to be done in recognition that that act was done against the wishes of the majority of the Irish people, that the border that was put in place was artificial, that it was done with one purpose, and that was to create an artificial majority based on religious lines by and large, and that led to the systemic discrimination and oppression and subsequently the conflict that I was talking about. So any event that's marking that has to also mark the lived experiences of everybody that was part of it. And there have been discussions and engagements and debates and events that Sinn Féin have participated in that have taken place in a cordial way, in a respectful way, that have acknowledged that there is a whole proportion of people who have a very different perception of what those events meant. And I think it is important that we recognize that, but it's also give a period and an opportunity for reflection on that negative view of what partition and the Northern state have meant. But to me, all of that needs to be put in the context of how we deliver a better future for the next generation, as opposed to being entirely, I suppose, directed by the experiences of previous generations. And to me, the answer lies in undoing the damages that were done 100 years ago and creating a future beyond partition.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to hand back to Barry. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Niamh. And I'll go back to Peter and, of course, Eugenio as well in the next kind of 8 or 9 minutes in case you have any questions or, well, at that stage, responses to anything that's been said. But I have a couple of things to put you, Matt, myself, but there's something I'm thinking about that is also often overlooked when considering Ireland and these islands, is that there's a huge amount of migration from Britain into Ireland as well. Anyone who's familiar with any community across the whole island of Ireland will know that there is, I still think, depending on what you're counting, I think it's the largest migrant group into Ireland.
Yep.
Those people, which is something always worth mentioning, I think. So Matt, I'm going to put 3 questions to you if I have time, right? And you've done great being quizzed by a bunch of Cambridge academics the past hour, so I think these are slightly broader, right? The first one is about a united Ireland, the second one is about the party, and the third one is about Irish politics. So the first one is a simple one on a united Ireland, Matt. How would you envision accommodating unionism within a new Irish state? Will Sturm be maintained? Will we have a new revamped parliament in Dublin or elsewhere? How would you, because you mentioned in your intervention that United Ireland, not everyone is going to agree with it, but they're still going to be living on the same rock in the North Atlantic. So how would you expect unionism to be accommodated within a new United Ireland?
Well, and this probably goes back to an earlier question that I think Peter had put. I could set out how I think unionism should be accommodated in a united Ireland, but I don't necessarily think it's for me to dictate what unionists need. And also, I think we need to recognize that unionism is a broad political philosophy. Within that, there are varying type and different communities, from working class Belfast estates to rural communities to seaside congregations, or whatever the term might be used, and all of which might have different needs and wants. So there, to me, would a Stormont Assembly be in place? I think absolutely it would be warranted for a transition period. How long that would be, what powers would remain devolved there, is open to debate. And lots of people get bogged down in terms of flags and anthems and what this would be and what that would be. Again, I have very strong views as to what I would like the flag to be and what I would like the national anthem to be, but I acknowledge that it isn't going to be for me to decide all of these things, or even for the people who agree with me to decide all of these things. That we have to create an inclusive space for people to actually share their views. And the truth is that there are lots of people whose views are really important in terms of what a new Ireland will look like, who won't engage in the debate until it's almost inevitable. And that needs to, so I think we would be doing a disservice to all of those people as well if we were to set out in absolute concrete terms that this is what a united Ireland will look like. I think if for a united Ireland to be the success that I believe it can be, then it has to be almost an ever-evolving project, even beyond the referendum itself. So in the short term, I think what we need to do is set out in very clear terms the parameters, the work that we need to do in order for the referendum to take place. And that's the point where I think the Irish government is failing. We need to have All Ireland fora through citizens' assemblies. We need to have Oireachtas all-party committees that invite representatives from the north to be part of that. The British government has a role to play in terms of how it will facilitate a referendum and what the referendum questions and all of the practical issues will be. Then we will also need to have almost the same procedure again in terms of what the outworking of that will be. People want to go, and we want to ensure that we don't make the same mistake as the Brexiteers, to put it bluntly. We don't want to have a referendum to be held to come out on the winning side and then scratch our heads as to what happens next. We want to have a very clear roadmap in terms of how we can make this the success that we know it can be.
Cheers, Matt. The seat you hold in Cavan Monaghan was won by Cavan O'Callaghan in 1997, and you said yourself that the party went from 1 to 5 to 4 to 14 to 23 to 37, I think, which by any standards, it's not flattery to say it's a remarkable growth of a party by European standards, given everything that you've mentioned about the party's kind of heritage and background. You also said that a united Ireland won't happen on your own, that it's not going to happen just with Sinn Féin. And indeed, I think the latest polls are 37% in the Republic, which is remarkable, extremely high. But there's still 37 seats, which is a long way towards a majority in the Dáil, which would be what, 80?
Yeah.
So, simple question, Matt, how can Sinn Féin win, right? So, can the party build a coalition to govern in the Republic, and what would it look like?
Yeah, well, in the first instance,
the party, sorry, I mean, in terms of an electorate, if the party has to double in size, what sort of changes would you have to make? Who would you have to attract? How could you do it?
Yeah, well, the first thing we'll need to do is run enough candidates. We left about 6 or 7 seats behind us simply because we didn't have a sufficient number of candidates the last time, which I can tell you, as somebody who had fought the European elections just the previous May, that was not something that we thought would be our problem. so we'll have to do that. We also need to run credible candidates across all 40 odd constituencies. We'll also need to put forward credible policies and to build steadily. I believe that there is a fundamental change in Irish politics, that there is an appetite for change that hasn't been seen arguably since the 1918 general election. It's something I feel and sense all the time. And the greatest reflection I get just talking to people in my own constituency, and as you say, my constituency would be a relatively strong and a historically strong base of support for Sinn Féin. But even, you know, the thing that is said to me most often is, we're going to give you a chance. So it hasn't that people have fully bought into the belief that Sinn Féin is going to solve all of their problems. They've just decided that this government and the parties that make up this government just don't have the capacity, the vision, or the ambition to actually address some of the big systemic problems in our society, and they're looking to other routes. And increasingly, they're looking to Sinn Féin. I see it as our job of work between now and the general election is to convince as many people that we are the vehicle to deliver that change as possible, to earn people's trust so that they will give us a chance to prove ourselves in government. And that'll take a number of different, different areas of work. We will need to continue to perform well in the Dáil. That means putting forward alternative budgets that are fully costed, but that actually set out how we will address things like the housing crisis and the deficiencies in healthcare and other public services, but also our work on the ground. It's one of the areas of traditional strength is that Sinn Féin representatives work really hard to actually deliver on the ground for the communities that put their faith in us. And I think that will need to continue as well. And of course, we'll have to try and just keep building momentum between here and the election. The biggest, I suppose, challenge as I see it to us entering government is apathy or despondency, or the sense that things can't be changed. And that, I suppose, is the bulwark, the great tool of conservatism. There is no alternative. We have to show very clearly that there is an alternative, that it is capable of delivering the type of change that's required, and that it actually has the credibility in order to be able to deliver that change.
It's an exciting time to be a Sinn Féin TD, I think, Matt.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to put my third question. What I want to do is, because I just see the time ticking on, there's a comment from a questioner that I want to read out to you, and then I'm going to hand you over to Eugenio, who would, would like to take the opportunity to ask you something. And then I'll give Peter and Niamh each a minute in case you have any kind of reflections that you want to put. So it's from Dominic Keown. How are you, Dominic? Just a comment. Dominic would agree that successive British governments have had a vested interest in maintaining their electorate disinformed about modern Irish history, by keeping their electorate disinformed about Irish history, particularly Sinn Féin's role. However, things have improved in recent years with a spate of competent documentaries on radio and TV on the centenary of Northern Ireland, the Troubles and the rebellion in 1916. It's essential, in my view, to keep up this momentum to expose long-standing misconceptions. So thanks for those reflections, Dominic. First will be Eugenie, and then we'll go in reverse order to Niamh, and then to Peter, and then I'll close.
Barry. I have a number of questions, but time is short, so I shall ask only one. If Sinn Féin was in government today, what should London expect from you that the present government is not doing already, especially with reference to the protocol and to the Northern Irish situation, the border, and indeed what should Brussels expect from such a government if we're in office today?
Interesting that you used the protocol in terms of do differently, because in fairness, we have worked with the Irish government in terms of the proposition and the need to put forward practical propositions that would address the quite obvious problem that Brexit presented, which is the potential for the re-emergence of any border or hardening of the border that's in Ireland. And I as an MEP was very pleased to have an opportunity to play what I would consider to be a constructive role in terms of our engagements with the Article 50 task force and with the Irish government, because without rehashing all of the challenges that Brexit presented to to the northern economy in particular, but to societally and politically in terms beyond the north into the border region across the entire island. It was really important that we came to a solution to resolve that, and a number had been put forward, and we were the first party that argued for what we called at the time special status for the north. But essentially what the protocol provides for is a special status for the north. It allows it to have access to both the British and the EU markets uniquely and without checks or balances. It presents some challenges. I think they've been grossly exaggerated in terms of some issues in terms of trading east to west. But I think they can be overcome. And I have to say, as somebody who's often very critical of the EU, I have been quite impressed by their willingness to put forward alternative propositions in order to address what could be perceived as genuine issues in that regard. I think the British government's role in all of this has been entirely destructive, and I think they have been essentially playing games with the peace in our country. And therefore, with regard to Brexit in the short term, I don't think that there would be much of a difference. We maybe see the need to be more forceful in times in terms of dealing with the British government. But the united political consensus is, and there's not too many areas where there is a political consensus in Irish politics at the moment, but it is that the protocol allows us to mitigate against the worst excesses of Brexit's implications for Ireland. And therefore, our message to the European Union would be to stand strong in that regard, and our message to the British government would be to wise up and back off.
You can have a quick response.
No, it's fine.
Sure. Brilliant. Then in the interest of time, thank you, Professor. Niamh and Peter, if you want to take about a minute each.
Yes, I've done very much to say. I feel bad I've taken a bit more time from you, Jenny, or perhaps you wanted to ask a second question. But just in general, Matt, thank you very much for coming today. I think it's really interesting hearing some of the opportunities facing Sinn Féin over the next few years, north and south of the border, but also the challenges as well. And I imagine any one of those would be a major problem for any single political party. And there are several that I know that the party's going to have to deal with over the next few years. So I imagine there's a lot of work going on in the background, not least for trying to unite an island that has very different views over what should happen to its future, both north and south, but indeed that wider community that you mentioned as well, and the extent to which you see them as a part of the future of Ireland, and if they can assist at all in that sort of ambition you're thinking of, which is this united Ireland. And by assist, I effectively mean being more electorally engaged in what you're doing, and perhaps having a larger constituency in Britain and elsewhere that you think might be I suppose, in tune with what Sinn Féin wants to do. So there are lots of challenges and opportunities for the party, and they come across in your talk. So thank you very much, not least in the political end, but also on the issues of climate, environment, and indeed this, and I do think there's a geographical kind of question here between rural communities and urban spaces and how they themselves are transforming in the decades in which we are a part of. So thank you very much again.
Thanks, Niamh.
Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to add my thanks and say that I've been, it's been really good to talk with you. I am struck looking at Irish politics from this side of the Irish Sea by the sheer radicalism of Sinn Féin's agenda and the things that were set out in the last manifesto on health and housing and tax changes. And it's clear that a Sinn Féin government would, in some ways face a steep challenge in delivering on that agenda whilst pursuing Irish unity at the same time. But I know that if that were to happen, I think Matt would be at the heart of it. And it's been really good to hear your perspective on the challenges that would be involved.
Thanks, Peter. Matt, it's only fair to give you the final word there if you want to respond. You can just say thanks if you want, but if you want to respond to anything that's just been said there.
No, I really enjoyed being part of this this debate, and I look forward to getting over to see you all at some point, if only to fulfill my mother's long-held ambition that I would go to Cambridge.
We welcome you with open arms, Matt. And I'd like to say as well, I've been around Cambridge for much of the past decade. I'm not sure if there's been many events where representatives of Sinn Féin have come in recent times, so we're absolutely thrilled that you're able to join us, Matt. And the discussion was great, and thank you all at home for listening and for tuning in. As always, the recording will be available on our website. And remember, next week we're going to host Ivana Bacik, Labour TD for Dublin Bay South. And then the following week, 6th of December, we're going to have Doug Beattie, MLA UUP from the Ulster Unionist Party. Matt, if you want to tune in then and put a few questions to Doug, you'd be most welcome. But so 2 great meetings, and then also be able to unveil the schedule of meetings you're going to have in 2022 as well, please God, in 2 weeks' time. So just for me to say thank you very much again, Matt, and everybody enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Stand up.
Bye-bye.